we're just gonna start off at the very beginning because I know the Eagle and Nix books are your baby. They're your they seem to have a very important place in your heart. You talk about them all the time. And that you started the first one. I think 2012 was when the first one came out, and then
That's right.
2015 was the second one, or was it 14?
2014.
2014, and then this is the third one. The first one by Del Rey, which if people want to know why, you have that on your blog. Um, and so I was just one thing that I'm really interested in is right off the bat you have your acknowledgments for this book, for the influences, all these authors that really inspired you for this one. And you have Burroughs, you have Robert Howard, you have Moorcock, and so on. So why don't you tell the readers a little bit about where this book comes from inside you? Because we know from your Forgotten Realms stuff and your Star Wars stuff and other stuff that you write some really dark stuff, but this one seems a far more personal story for you. Where did this one stem from, or the characters in
Yeah,
general?
so that's actually well observed. So here's where they come from. When I was in sixth grade, one of my friends introduced me to D&D and fantasy fiction. And of course, the first thing that I read was The Hobbit and then The Lord of the Rings. And it was kind of, eye-opening for me at the time. And I was sort of wide-eyed about it. And I really loved it. And then subsequent to that, as sort of my reading taste expanded, I started on Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and the Mouser books and Moorcock's Elric books and Howard's Conan stories. And for me, those books resonated in a way that exceeded even Tolkien, and they spoke to me in this way. I mean, they were the kind of books I loved to read because they made me smile and turn pages rapidly, and I found the plotting propulsive and the dialogue engaging. And so right then, I suspect, is when the seed for my professional writing career was planted, although obviously it was many, many years before I actually grew into anything. But I've always wanted to circle back to those kinds of stories. And as I've written over the years with my Erebus Kale stories and the Forgotten Realms and my Star Wars stuff, I do try to write in this kind of sort of cinematic, kind of rapidly paced, a lot of action, intricate, interesting characters with kind of rapid fire dialogue. And I always try to do that. But with Eggle and Nix, because it's entirely my own world, and so the tone is entirely my own, I felt like I could really speak in a kind of true authorial voice, if you will, with these characters and these stories. And so, it just grew out of that. And they are, in some ways, the easiest books I've ever written, because I feel like I know all my characters. I mean, I've written 8 books with Erebus Kale, and lots of readers love Kale, and I do too. But these guys just speak to me in a different kind of way. And so I can just sit down and know exactly what jokes Nix would crack as scenes unfold, and how Eggle would perceive these things. And it's a blast to write. And I think at least for some readers, it's a blast to read.
It is a blast. It's definitely the way these characters are. These are basically, like if you're reading like the mysteries, like the chain smoking, smart alecky detective, but these are fantasy characters, so they're hard drinking, crazy rogues that aren't ever actually good, but they're not actually terrible, if that makes sense.
No, yeah, right. The tone of the books is, the world is a kind of a gritty, dirty world where magic is mysterious and non-systematized, which I actually like a lot, and I think adds a lot to the mystery of magic. Books that epic fantasies that build really elaborate magic systems that operate on the basis of these kind of erudite rules and all of that is also great. But I do, as a reader, I love reading a story where I just don't know everything there is to know about the rules of magic. So it's this really weirdly unpredictable thing. So it's got that kind of gritty feel in terms of the setting and the tone, but the characters in some ways are ultimately optimistic, I think, in a way. Now, notwithstanding all the challenges they face, notwithstanding all the grime and blood and kinds of things that they face all the time, they nevertheless sort of strike this sort of optimistic note overall. And in that respect, they do differ somewhat from my previous work.
And
and as you say, they're not good or bad. They're just kind of cheerful warriors in a way.
Yeah, I've seen lots of people compare this series to, say, Game of Thrones and stuff, but honestly, I don't when I read it, I don't really think of Game of Thrones. I think of another Howard series. I think of like Solomon Kane, which is dark and dour, but he's also, he's not necessarily a good person, but he's not the worst person, and he does good things as he goes. And that's honestly, when you thought of Howard, I thought, this is Solomon Kane. This stemmed from that sort of world. That I love Solomon Kane more than I like Conan when it comes to Howard, so I'm a little biased when it came to that, though.
Well, no, but that's precisely right, and that's high praise. And I guess I'll take comparisons to Game of Thrones all day, but it's a very different kind of thing. I mean, obviously, Game of Thrones is very political, very sort of epic in its scope, and this is a much more personal kind of sword and sorcery series with guys who are just trying to get along. They're just trying to get by as much as anything. They certainly don't have political ambitions, but to some extent, I think when people talk about the game, when they make those kinds of comparisons, maybe they're thinking about the visceralness of some of the violence, perhaps. But yeah, I agree with you overall. I think it's a much more personal, let's say, kind of optimistic sort of. I always think about it, if it was a movie, it's closest to Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah, that makes sense, and unlike like Game of Thrones, which as much as I like those books, these stories flow a lot faster, and they're dense, but they're not as thick, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, exactly right. Yeah, no, I try to do. What I'm trying to do, as I say, I use the word propulsive a lot, but I'm trying to tell ripping yarns, sort of first and foremost. That's my primary goal. But I do like to. And I do this with all my writing. I suppose all writers do, but I do like to sneak in some sort of philosophical themes. And Ego is a great vehicle for that, because he's this kind of philosophical priest of a dead god. He's a congregation of one, and he's a bit navel gazing at times. So he's a nice conduit for addressing some of the philosophical issues that the stories present.
And when it comes to this one, one thing I do appreciate is this story you can read on its own, but it definitely helps if you've read the other ones. But being the fact that you can read it on its own is useful, because the other ones, I don't know if it's been fixed of late, but they went out of print for a while, didn't they? Because they were kind of hard to find.
Well, no, they were never out of. No, what happened is, so originally the Hammer and the Blade and Discourse and Steel were picked up by Angry Robot, which is a UK publisher. Produces great books. I mean, has a whole host of extraordinary authors, and has done some great things with authors like Wes Chu and Chuck Wendig and so on. So, very well-regarded publisher. But and the books did really well for them. What happened was, and this is a sort of a personal story. I don't want to get boring about it, but they wanted to do some additional Eggle and Nix books, and I did too. But I wanted to ensure that, I work a day job. I'm a corporate lawyer, and I've got a family with 4 young children. And so my time is really at a premium. So it got to the point where I thought I need to be really mindful of the kinds of books that I'm doing and for whom I'm doing them. And an opportunity presented itself with these books that I could take them to a much larger publisher with a much larger distribution network. And so I jumped at that. And so what happened was they never actually went out of print. What happened was, or there might have been a brief window when there was kind of a transition, but once Del Rey picked up the rights to publish Hammer and the Blade and Discourse and Steel in the U.S., Angry Robot at that point stopped distributing their version. And then, there's a little bit of ramp-up time before Del Rey could print and distribute the reissues of the books. And then Conversation of Blood followed after that. So the Hammer and the Blade and Discourse and Steel are still in print. It's just the Del Rey version that's in print in the U.S. Angry Robot still has the right to distribute those first 2 books in other areas of the world, and does.
And and Angry Robot, come thinking about it, I think I actually have one of their books on my shelf because I think it's called United States Japan by Pierre Tirias. I believe that's done by them though.
Uh,
But yeah, that's. Oh, go on.
Go ahead.
I was saying like, they're a good distributor, especially overseas, and when if you're going to
Yeah,
be.
and they are a great publisher. I mean, those guys, Mark and Lee, at least no longer with Angry Robot. I think he went over to tour, but those guys they're great. I mean, that whole outfit is great. But it is at the end of the day, it's a lean sort of publisher. It's not a small press, but it's not obviously one of the big presses.
It's not
So
Simon and
they run
Schuster
very
and so
lean,
on.
and the books, they all wear a lot of different hats and so on. But boy, it's a great experience, and I'd publish with them again in a minute.
So, one thing I've noticed about your books, and this book probably does it better than I've seen I've read a lot of your books, the better than I've seen your books do is you start off fast and furious. It seems like you spend a lot of time on your hook in the first chapter to really get us in, and this one does that really, really well. Why don't you tell us about how you, if that is true, if you really focus on that hook in the first chapter, and how do you get readers hooked so early in your books?
Well, it is true that I did focus that I focused pretty heavy on that in this book, but in general I do. I mean, Riptide in some ways has a lot of similarities in the opening to that's one of my Star Wars novels to Conversation in Blood in terms of the way that it opens, and Hammer and the Blade opens kind of that way too. But yeah, there are a lot of books in the marketplace, and readers, thankfully, have lots of different choices and ways to sort of satisfy whatever bug they may have for stories. So, as an author, what you want to do, if you can, is grab a reader's attention very quickly and pique their interest very quickly. So, we all try to write that way. The story, as I developed the underlying concept in A Conversation in Blood, the kind of opening that the book has seemed to fit really well. So, I mean, in this case, it was easy. I mean, because once I developed and I'm trying not to give away any spoilers because it's kind of a big spoiler, but once I developed the underlying concept associated with the story, then having an opening of that kind was basically a no-brainer.
And, like your books are never the slow burn. They're fast and furious, and they always, keep moving at a pace which is not necessarily breakneck, but it makes it so you don't want to stop reading, which is what I like. In this one, by the time I finished it, I felt it was actually kind of short, which I guess on average on fantasy books is 250 pages, I think, thereabouts.
And, yeah, it depends on how they format the book. But I mean, the word count's the same as essentially all my books, but different publishers format somewhat differently. So, a typical story of mine is usually around the 90, 100,000 word mark.
Okay, that makes sense. And so that's on average in a paperback, that's about standard 280, 300 pages thereabouts. It's not
in that neighborhood.
It's not like the George R. R. Martin's 700,000 word vomit on the page.
No, that's right. Well, that's why obviously poor George can't put out a book a year because each of his books is really the equivalent of 4 or 5 of most of us. And that's true of a lot of epic fantasy writers. And that's when you spend an enormous amount of time world building and have 12 or 13 different points of view characters, that's what you need to do. So that's sensible. But when you're telling a sword and sorcery story, and you've got really 2, maybe 3 point of view characters, things are a little leaner.
Have you ever been tempted with this series, or really to any of your series, to expand that to the point where you'd have to have a novel kind of like we just said, Game of Thrones, where you have to expand it so much to have more point of view characters? Or do you like focusing in on 2 characters or 3 characters that you really, really know a lot like the back of your hand and just tell the story through them?
It really, when I wrote for Wizards of the Coast, and one of the series I wrote there, the Heroes Guild series, is called The Twilight War. And The Twilight War actually got a lot of comparisons to Game of Thrones, stupid way back when, because it is kind of epic in scope. It has a lot of politics and war and many, many point of view characters. And that was appropriate because it fit that story. Sword and sorcery stories, that's why so many of them there are so many sword and sorcery short stories, but there aren't so many sword and sorcery novels. I mean, if you look at Robert E. Howard, you really have one. You have Hour of the Dragon, and that's it. Everything else from Conan, anyway, is more or less a short story. The short story or the sword and sorcery genre fits best with duos or trios. I think really small groups of men and women as the protagonists, and works best, I think, when both magic and the villains are somewhat kind of mysterious and seen through the eyes of the protagonist. So all of that kind of gravitates towards the kind of story that Eggle and Nick's stories are, which is, you take the point of view of one or two of the duo, and that's more or less what you stick with throughout the bulk of the story, except when you're taking the villain's point of view. And now and again, you may deviate from that depending on the needs of the scene, but the bulk of the story is there. So with these stories, or with any kind of sword and sorcery story, no, I wouldn't have any. I think you'd lose the flavor of sword and sorcery if you tried to have 10 or 12 different point of view characters, because the nature of the story, it would either be really terrible because the point of view would be shifting so much that the reader would just get annoyed with it, or in order to have a story that was well served by that kind of head jumping, it would have to be a different kind of story altogether. In this case, you're not really writing a sword and sorcery tale.
Okay. So back to your main characters, Eagle and Nix. Having followed a lot of your work, and I follow you on Facebook and other stuff, there seems to be your humor, like your actual humor and the way you talk, seems to be all over this book. How much of your personality do you just inject into these two characters and make them you?
I think probably a lot, depending on my mood. I am. You and I think have been Facebook friends a long time, so I'm very serious about certain kinds of subjects, political subjects, matters of public policy. I'm similarly serious about matters of religion and faith and things of that sort. I'm not personally religious, but it's a subject that I've read a lot about, and so I like to discuss that in kind of in-depth, I like to think, cerebral way. So that's kind of Eggle, really. I mean, Eggle's kind of that aspect, I suppose. There's a lot of my personality in him, whereas on a lot of subjects, I just try to be sort of witty and funny, and I think that bleeds into Nix a lot. So yeah, I mean, in some ways they do echo at least a couple sides of my personality.
Okay.
Maybe that's why they're so much fun to write.
Yeah, well, that's what it seems, because it seems like these ones that flow out of you, and you always talk about wanting to write them, or always talk about them, and it just seems to be, these seem to be the most you that you've ever written. Not that everything else isn't, but this seems to be the most, most the way.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably true. I think you're right about that.
So, these books being your personal stories that, if you wanted to, you could self-publish if you wanted, because they're yours as you go. What has writing in, say, you've written in some very big franchises. What has writing in big franchises done to help you be able to tell your own stories in a way like this, where you can just let them flow out and they come out the way you want them to?
That's an interesting question. One of the things that I'm often asked the flip side of that, which is what kind of constraints do you face when you write in tie-in, and how does that compare with writing original world fiction? And I suppose the questions really are sort of two sides of the same coin. I think so when I write in Star Wars or the Realms, I have in both of those cases tried to write in areas of those worlds or franchises, little corners where I had as much kind of creative freedom from the existing canon as I could. So a lot of the Star Wars books, especially when I initially started with the line, I was writing about a character that had never really been written about in a novel before, had very little lore established with him, and I kind of set the story out on a fringe, so it really didn't intrude on or interact much with the existing canon, because I wanted to have as much freedom as I could at that point. Now, subsequent to that, I've written a Darth Vader book, who obviously comes with a lot of baggage is the wrong word, but a lot of lore, expectations, canon, all of that. So one of the things that I suppose you learn as you're writing in those franchises and you have these kinds of constraints is you see where those are. And again, they've been very loose for me, though. But nevertheless, there are some. And you see where those are. And then when you're doing your own stuff, you can just sort of drive right through those. So, I was talking earlier about the way that I deliberately and consciously keep magic non-systematized in the world of El Earth, which is the setting for the Eggle and Nix novels. I do that in part, again, because I love it as a reader. I think about Thieves' World, and I don't know if you've ever read the Thieves' World anthologies, but, there are a whole bunch of different writers writing in a shared setting. They all have different kind of wizards, and the wizards all operate on a different basis in terms of the way that they operate their magic.
Hmm.
So that's always been kind of something that I really liked. Now, when you write in a franchise like the Forgotten Realms, magic's very systematized. And you have to work in that system unless you have a very good reason not to. And then you have to explain to the readers, because they know the system too. You have to explain to them how this deviates and why, so that it sort of still squares with the underlying rules. Well, so that's a kind of constraint that you face when you do franchise. And when you do your own, if you choose the path that I have, which is to have this non-systematized structure for your magic, I can just blow right through. And I have I have so much fun with the magic system in Eggle and Nix, just like the talking key, the morphic key, and some of the kinds of things that occur in the world that are a shock to the characters at times, and I'm sure, I hope, are at least occasionally delightful for readers, because there's not this underlying set of rules that they can see or perceive. There are just these little neat surprises that can crop up. So I guess it's a very long-winded way of saying, when you're used to operating within the bounds of some constraints and you see where they are, then when you do your own thing, you can elbow out from behind those and have some fun.
So is this a series that you have notes on, written out, other ideas where it can go, how the world works, just for your own reference when you're writing it and so on? Or is this one that's just all in your head and you let it flow as you go?
No, I do have things written out. There's nothing encyclopedic. I don't have like gazetteers on Durfallen and some of that stuff. But I do have, I do write out the facts and things, so that I have consistent references across the books, obviously, and can build on these things. And and some of them, and then that way you can sort of slowly, you can layer in hooks in early books that you reveal later on. So there's an architectural feature in Durfallen that features importantly in A Conversation in Blood. And of course, it's obviously been there throughout the three books, and it's always been an object of kind of mystery and its origins hinted at, but never really explored. And then finally, you get to get a sense of that in A Conversation in Blood. So yeah, I've got that stuff, and I reference it as needed.
But it's not like Dune, where Frank Herbert dies and all of a sudden they can write 20,000 more books based on his notes that he's.
No, well, I mean, I suppose you could, but but again, that's one of the things that's nice about writing small scale like this, is that there's always a lot of room to explore, because I'm sort of exploring the world kind of in microcosm with each book. A little bit more Durfallen gets explored. We dealt with in Hammer and the Blade. They ventured across the Demon Waste to a neighboring realm called Ephirian and things like that. But there hasn't been a giant sort of pull. The camera hasn't pulled back to reveal everything. So there's always more that you could. I mean, if you wanted to just craft and create things, I know, I've got the 7 cities in Meander, and I know which one of those there are, and all of that. But there's plenty of room to just invent new things if needed or wanted.
So the last time we had you on, we were talking, I believe, we were talking about Godborn. I think that's the last time we had you on.
Could be.
And we talked a lot about how you having kids influenced aspects of that book, and some of the harsher realities that book tells. And so I was wondering, now your family's grown since the last time you wrote one of these books, and that always changes the dynamic and how you think and so on. How has your expanding family or your family life affected the way these stories have come out? Are there any aspects that have come out directly because of your kids and the stories that you can tell now as a father of a growing family?
Yes, I think probably that is the case. And the sort of the thing that jumps right to my mind is my daughters. So now I have two young daughters in addition to my twin sons who are tweens now. And I look at, I think about stories somewhat differently now. And, you know, maybe I was slow to come to these realizations. But, you know, I think a lot more about the male gaze in stories now than maybe I did 10 years ago. And the part and role that female characters play in my stories as I write them. Because I have, you know, in the past, I have described, and still do, I mean, I still stand by this characterization, but I have described the Eggle and Nick stories as a kind of masculine story. And I don't mean that in some gender essentialism kind of fashion. I just mean one of my favorite writers is a guy named Daniel Woodrell. He doesn't write fantasy. He writes, you know, Whiskey Bar. He wrote Winter's Bone, if you've ever seen the film. It had Jennifer Lawrence, kind of a breakout role. But the extraordinary writer, very sparse in his prose, but I mean extraordinary stuff. But he's always described as a kind of masculine writer too, because of the settings, because of the characters, because of the nature of the violence, and so on. And as I say, I've always kind of described the Eggle and Nick stories that way as well. I actually caught a lot of hell for that once upon a time, but nevertheless, still stand by that characterization. But at the same time, I try to be very conscious of both the portrayal of female characters in the story and the impact of kind of my male gaze on the story and how that affects characters and their interactions and so on. So it has definitely had that effect, and that certainly bleeds through with the way that Eggle and Nix interact with female characters in the world and story.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it definitely has a. I know one of the biggest complaints when it comes to science fiction or fantasy is usually how female characters are treated. I've seen that, repeatedly. George R. R. Martin, no exception. And it's definitely a harder thing to tackle than most people think. But I think having girls probably helps a lot because you have more of that connection to what sensitivities there are and how they feel, how they think, and so on. And it makes it more believable overall versus this is a man's book for men, which is
right. No, absolutely right. I mean, I write the books for everybody, but it is an issue. It's actually been an issue I've been conscious of with this series throughout. It's interesting that the Hammer and the Blade. I was talking with you earlier about. I try to sort of sprinkle in some sort of philosophical issues, or at least important kind of commentary into some of the books. And the Hammer and the Blade, in some ways, looks like, and I can always tell. I'm not even going to say because it'd be knocking reviewers. But some reviewers see the book in a certain way, and others, the thing that I was trying to do, actually, they perceive and it comes through. And I suppose for those who don't perceive it, maybe that's my own shortcomings as an author. But I try to actually invert some of the tropes. So it's typically associated with certain source. So the damsel in distress trope seems very present in the book, but by the end of the book, if you think about the way that events unfold, that it actually is precisely the opposite of that. And some readers pick up on that, others do not. And at the end of the day, I guess I don't really care that much. I just care that people have a good time reading the book. But it is one of the things that I'm conscious of as I write these stories. And it is, I think, owing mostly to Delaney and Sloan.
So we're gonna. I think I have two more questions left before we wrap. One is, I've interviewed and talked to Michael Moorcock on the show. And his Elric stories are they're a type of fantasy that you don't usually see anymore. It's very it's an old school way of telling, and he is it's not very it's hard to talk to an author who's like, oh yeah, I talked with T.G. White and Tolkien the other day, and I'm like, what?
Yeah,
when I was a kid,
yeah, and he's a legend, right?
And and so on. So I'm just wondering, being that I've met him and I've talked to him, what sort of influence, you've talked a lot about Howard and these other people, how they've influenced. What sort of influence did Elric, I'm assuming the Elric books, have on you, and how does that bleed into writing Eagle and Nix and these stories? You credited him at the very beginning for helping with
right.
this.
Well, I mean, a couple of things. One is, that I think, and obviously I can't. For me, I guess I'll just speak to how the books spoke to me rather than trying to attribute meaning to Mr. Moorcock. The Elric books seem to me to be a kind of reaction against sort of Tolkienist epic fantasy, good triumphs over evil, pretty clear protagonists, antagonists, not a lot of gray areas in the story. And then you get Elric, who at the beginning of the series is the last, the last royal in a decadent, dying empire, who is physically weak, absent this magical blade. But the only way that he gets strength is by using the blade to drain other souls. And that whole story kind of expanded. I was young when I read these, so it kind of expanded my concept of what fantasy could do, and the kind of I've said in other interviews that fantasy is a really extraordinary vehicle for exploring morality, and Moorcock did it really well. And so that for me became a touchstone, very much of like my Arabic scale stories for Game was because of a real plain and obvious direct Elric connection there. It's a bit less obvious than the Egil and Nick stories because the nature of the stories is somewhat different. The sweep of the Elric stories is, although we talked earlier about short novels, those things are about 150 pages. And but the sweep of them taken as a whole is epic and extraordinary. And if you think about the world too of Moorcock's Elric, can you think of how magic was systematized at all? Like it really wasn't. I mean, there were rituals and things like that, but I mean, there were just a lot of, I don't want to say crazy things because they were so like wondrous when you read them. But they, you think of Racker the Red Archer in the castle on the edge of it's been years since I read it, but right there on the edge of the abyss, where like the land beyond the castle is like it's chaos embodied, so it's in this constant state of flux. That kind of sense of wonder that I got from Elric is something that I didn't even get out of Tolkien. It just felt like you almost had this direct plug into Moorcock's imagination, and it just kind of, he just let it leak out onto the page. And man, I just love that. And so, when I write, particularly when I write the Egil and Nick stories, I try to kind of, I want to capture that same feeling and hopefully communicate that to other readers. So I just let, my imagination go and hopefully it's coming through on the page.
Okay, and then the last question before we wrap up is, I'm quite sure, as with your other books, you've put little Easter eggs or stuff in here for fans, especially to pay attention to. Are there things in this book that you want fans to dig out, and how excited are you for them to get this book very soon and start finding these things that you've hidden specifically for your list for your readers?
Yeah, there are a few things like that. I mean, I can think of a couple, and I'm really, really eager to have people read the book. I'm very interested. I haven't seen it yet. I've seen a few. There have been a couple of very good reviews that have hit already, and I haven't seen the observation that I'm interested in seeing. My son actually did. He did his do these little, essentially a book report. They call them independent reading assignments for his honors English class, and he read an arc of A Conversation in Blood while he did it. And so, we were able to talk a little bit about it before he wrote. And he did kind of observe the way that, there's almost no way that I could say it without spoiling it, so I'm not going to do that. But I haven't seen the thing that I'm interested to see the most in a review, just to see if somebody kind of picks up on it, because the structure of the book is unusual, and it's not unusual just because of where it starts. It's unusual because of where it ends, and I haven't seen anybody yet articulate that unusualness, but I'm sure somebody will. I mean, we'll see.
Well, I can say I haven't written my review yet because I just got to the end of the book, but I loved it. It's great, and you know how much I loved Godborn and so on, and this topped that. So I have to.
Well, I really appreciate that.
Articulate.
I'm glad to hear that.
So
yeah, and these are, as you said. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, as you said, these are, and again, this is in the flavor of Howard's Conan stories. I mean, ideally, people read these, all three of them, one after another, but in theory, you can jump in just about anywhere. I mean, whatever references you need to know to read A Conversation in Blood, if you haven't read Hammer the Blade, Discourse and Steel, you can read. And I don't think that it will actually spoil those books if you decide after reading Conversation you want to go back and read the others that happened before it. So, and that's why I intend to keep the series going. I mean, with the next book, I plan to do it kind of the same way. We touch on previous events as necessary, but you don't have to have a comprehensive sort of encyclopedic memory of the previous events in order to enjoy the current story. They are designed to be self-contained and somewhat standalone.
And one thing I really appreciate about this is a really dense book, but it's at the length that I can feel like I can reread it to get the stuff I missed without it feeling like a very daunting task. And that's something that's usually dense books are also dense in length, and that's daunting to say I'm going to reread this again to see what I missed.
I hear you, man. I'm always hurting for reading time too. But
So
good. That's good to hear.
so that's last thing. Tell listeners where they can find this book, and where they can find it. Any special events you might be having to do with it, or how to ask you more questions about it.
Yeah, so you can find it everywhere, in all the places. So it'll be in every bookstore and everywhere online. So grab it anywhere. I'm on Facebook at Paul S. Kemp, and love interacting with people there and do it all the time. It's one of the highlights of being a writer, frankly, that I get to interact with readers all the time. I'm also on Twitter at Paul S. Kemp, and then my website is paulskemp.com. But I use that primarily just for larger sort of blog entries and promotional stuff. But if you want to sort of chat with me or interact with me and other readers, come on to Facebook or Twitter. I don't really have a lot of events because my day job is consuming, and then I have young children to make travel hard. So no cons or anything in the near future or anything along those lines. And hopefully that'll change one day when I'm retired from the law, but that's a few years off.
Once you're so successful at writing that you can retire from law and not feel it, then
Yeah, so everybody go buy 2 copies of the book, and that'll come that much sooner.
well, thank you so much for giving us so much of your time, and I look forward to hearing what other people think of A Conversation of Blood. I loved it, and I hope everyone else loves it too. Thank you so much, sir.
I appreciate it. Had a great time. Thanks, Jeremiah.